topic is really about capacity versus demand, and there's a lot of aspects to this. I've taken an approach to talk more about the capacity demand concept and how things like skills can be factored into that and different metrics to look at for capacity versus demand. And in this session, there's a lot to cover in this topic. So of course, with a half an hour, I'm going to focus on it. So what we're going to do, if you haven't been to one of our webinars before, is I've got the phones muted so that I can get through the material. And then as we get close to the half hour, I will be unmuting the lines, but I will also be stopping the recording. So you are welcome to ask questions. You'll not be recorded, and it won't be, your voice won't be loaded up on our website when we do the YouTube video version of this. So so certainly welcome for open conversation or take some notes on questions you may want to ask when we get to that point. As we get to the start of the webinar, I just always want to highlight what's coming up next. And next week we do have another webinar. This is actually how to do scheduling and bench management in the OpenAir tool, not OpenAI, OpenAir. I hope you join us for that because that's a system-specific webinar. Also, on the conference front, in the fall, conference season starts up again pretty heavily, and we're going to be at the TSW conference in Las Vegas on October 15th to 17th. We will be a speaker as well as a sponsor, so we look forward to seeing you there. So really, this is the agenda that was part of the webinar advertisement. When you signed up, you saw these 3 bullets. And really, I'm taking them in almost a reverse order because I want to talk about what does capacity mean, what does demand mean, and then how does that factor into the need for skill tracking in some cases so that you can get a lot of information out of just those 2 basic words, capacity and demand. So as I go into what the definition of capacity is to me defined as what available resources you have to deliver services. And of course, I'm talking about capacity in the context of professional services. So capacity being the available resources to deliver services, what kind of capacity do you mean, or what kind of available services do you mean? This could be something as simple as the head count of people or the head count of people by type of person, like project manager or database architects. So those are types of resources because the projects or the engagements that you get involved with have to have a mix of those roles that have to be performed on a project. It could also be by skill category, and this is why we'll talk about skill profiles a bit in a couple slides. And this could be, hey, this is an integration project, but you find out that it's a QuickBooks integration, or it's an Oracle integration, or it's an SAP integration. And those may be very different skill sets because the systems involved, the basic topic of an integration is passing data from point A to point B, but how you actually connect and understand the environments in those endpoints may drive different skill sets in the organization or the technology you have to use. And then there's also a way to think about capacity is like, what is my delivery capacity? So it's not so much about the number of people that I need, but it's how many hours of work can I deliver as an organization or as a team. And that comes into play with things like utilization. If you've watched some of our other webinars on key metrics, utilization is a pretty common one in the world of services because a big asset in the services teams are your people, and people are measured by utilization and quite often to be able to understand whether they're sort of earning the revenue for the company that would cover the cost of that resource. And then finally, the capacity also can be defined as the revenue capacity. So this is where you factor in not only the number of hours you can deliver, but what's the value to the organization of those hours. And that could be something like a standard bill rate or a target bill rate. It could be a target bill rate for levels of people. And just doing the simple math of hours times rate gives you how much revenue could you potentially earn if you hit all of your goals in the organization and don't have any kind of leading factors other than, changing the rates as you need to increase it based on industry standards. So there's a lot of just basic information that you can capture for capacity, and capacity means different things to different people, but I think I've kind of covered a majority of the ways that I've seen it used in the industry: headcount, skill type, hours, and then the total revenue that you can earn as an organization. And really when it comes to things like headcount tends to, especially if you're tracking it by skill, headcount tends to give you ways to do capacity measures, to have insight into how you need to do talent management. So you're heavy on QuickBooks integration people, but your demand is for Oracle integration people. So obviously there's a little bit of a disconnect there. So can you start doing some retraining, or do you have to invest in hiring more people that have that other skill set? And then the hours and the revenue really give you the ability to say, okay, so if I expect to hit a $30 million target for revenue, but my delivery capacity based on current staffing is only 27 million, I've got a deficit or a gap of 3 million. So how am I going to fill that? Is that going to be subcontractors? Do I have to hire? So that tends to factor into more strategic decisions about getting resources versus training resources. Right. Now, from a demand perspective, demand is the comparison factor. So demand is where we're looking to say, so what do you need? What are we saying that we have to deliver? And that primarily comes in from a sales perspective. So as your sales team is out there, as your services team are talking to customers, then they're finding opportunities that would drive the ability to get new engagements or extend engagements. And then that turns into your sales pipeline, your backlog management of what's been sold, so how do you deliver that? And the demand really, to me, plugs in very nicely to resource management, your resource scheduling methodology, sort of how do you plan for when you're going to deliver work, because the when drives the who, and the who drives the how much, and the how much is your demand. So the demand can definitely be driven based on hours as well as money, because if you're connecting it into the sales cycle, that demand is by nature of being sold, it's a money thing, right? So what is being sold, what has been sold, and then being able to tag it so that it lines up with capacity. So if you're doing an hours measure by type of resource, your demand, you want to be able to understand that you're selling work, you're doing SOWs, and the type of resource you need in the SOW lines up with the capacity measures you have, so you can do an apples-to-apples comparison. Okay. So from that demand perspective, now we have to figure out, okay, so how do you get demand? How do you track demand? And demand this is where it starts bleeding into your skill database that you may have set up in the system. So the basic the basic demand grouping that I see is by job category. And a pretty clear one in many cases is project manager, right? And then there's variations from there, like I need certain types of technical people. So I need an integration resource. I need a database architect. I need a QA person to do my testing. And those are all key roles potentially on a project. So when you hire somebody in, quite frequently organizations will tag that person as, we're hiring you to be a QA person. So you're a QA person, and that's your job title or profile or category. And then because you have that associated with you, you as a resource have the ability to have a work schedule, a number of hours, and so therefore you have a capacity of hours. And when you're doing planning, you plan for resources to do those work. So if I get scheduled to do something, I have a forecasted effort of hours for my resource, and I'm a QA person, so therefore I have a forecast of QA hours to do in the system. And of course, whenever you have an hours metric, you can also do a headcount metric, because you can understand what does it mean to have an 8-hour schedule when there's only one day involved, and if your working days are 8 hours, your equivalent of a head count is 1. Okay. So the job category is sort of the basic grouping. I try to stay away from the word title, very much because title can be, it could be, Queen Bee of the latest technology on the East Coast, when in fact I just want to have, that you're a manager. So you definitely, job category tends to be a little more simplified list, and people are usually associated with a job category when they get hired in. So that gives you your capacity, and then as the demand is being measured, the demand is related to how you sell something for services and how you identify the resources that need to deliver that. And in a services world, quite often solution selling tends to drive sort of team concepts. I need this much of a PM, this much of a QA, this much of a programmer, this much of a DBA, and this much of a technical architect type thing. Okay. Now, a next level down might be different skills, and this is where we get into things like subject matter expert. So yes, I have an integration expert, but that integration expert knows integration technologies like Del Boomi very, very well. Or they're an integration expert from an architecture perspective, but not necessarily from an implementation perspective. So they do more of the big picture type stuff. So the job category is one level, but the skill database tends to take it down to another level, because you want to be able to identify what kind of skills they have, what kind of knowledge they have, and what capabilities they have in your organization. So beyond the job category, with the skill being able to break people down to that lower level, it also gives you a way to identify career paths, performance management, and there's whole systems dedicated to this, HR systems dedicated to this concept. But inside your organization, you want some way to track the fact that you have DBAs, but we have DBAs, Oracle DBAs, you have SAP DBAs, and I keep using DBA because that's a very technical thing, so it's easy for me to kind of use that as an example. But those resources, a DBA is not all DBAs are alike, so you want to be able to track the skills they have, technologies, and even things like the languages that are available. Whether you're using resources outside of your geography, where you would have to consider things like, can they travel internationally? Do they have a passport? What's their H-1B visa status? Those are all other things that you can track beyond the technology piece of it, or things like language. Now, when we get into building a skill database, there's some do's and some don'ts that I tend to talk with customers about. And the do's are track the things that you really need to leverage. And when I say that, what I mean is if you have a need to look for people by job category, make sure you have job categories. If you have a need for understanding the types of databases, for example, that people know about, track databases. If you don't ever need to look up whether somebody can speak a language, which I see that tracking language is usually valuable, but if you never have to look up whether there's somebody who speaks French versus German versus Spanish, then don't track it. Because the more things that you put into the database, the harder it is to maintain. So you want to make sure that you're focusing on what you really need to track. Okay? So what I find is very useful is product experience, because typically professional services, they're dealing with process and methodology, but then they're also dealing with technology. So the technology drives product needs. So you want to be able to track products. You want to be able to track industry. Using the word booking in different audiences means completely different things. Booking time could mean you're entering your time. When you talk to a services team, if you say booking to the revenue team, they're saying, well, we're booking revenue for the company. If you say booking to the sales team, that means they sold an order. So those are all different terms. So the industry experience is actually a very helpful thing to track, I find, because if you have someone that can talk in terms of IT services versus medical equipment services, those are all different nomenclatures to be able to deal with. The job role experience, so if people have performed in different roles, So they have done project management, they have done database architecture. You may have resources on your team that do have a jack-of-all-trades type of background. So can they, in a pinch, fill roles on teams where you're short on skill categories and skill sets? So that could be a useful one. And languages and certifications are, the more concrete. Can you do it or can you not do it type thing, or are you certified or are you not certified? So those are all good things to track. There's one that I see often tracked, which is soft skill experience, and I do have an opinion on that. So I'll get to that in just a second. Soft skill experience I find is not accurate very, very often. So I'll talk about what I mean by soft skill in the next slide. But really, as you track these typical categories, you don't usually have something say product experience. You usually break it down by database products or software products or hardware products or phones or something like that. So there's really like a subcategory that typically is involved in the skill database. Now, the what not to track. So when we start talking about products, it's very easy to start going down the path of, well, I know, in the Internet Explorer 1.0 really well versus Internet Explorer 15.2, and that seems like it would be very useful to track, but in fact it really just brings noise, because if you know one version, you know all versions pretty much. The only time I see that it's really useful to track version numbers when you get into skills like this is if there's some major shift. Like for those of you, I'm dating myself, so I say Windows 3 versus Windows 95, huge shift in what that meant in the world. So that would make sense to track something like that. But if it's 1.0 versus 1.2 versus 2.0, that's usually not something that you want to track. And the other thing that I would recommend not tracking is things that people are expected to do every day. And this is actually where I see a lot of the soft skill tracking that people attempt to do fail, unless there's some kind of certification or achievement that has to happen attached to that soft skill. So things like, presentation capability. Everyone can present, and everyone may be disagreeing with me on a phone call right now, but everyone can do a presentation. It's a matter of the quality of the presentation, the comfort, the communication ability, the way to communicate, sort of the professionalism that goes with it and the training and the experience that comes behind it. So saying whether you can do presentations and saying whether you're good at them or not, that's kind of hard to really concretely put into a skill database. And would you ever actually track, look people up to say, well, I'm going to look up somebody who's no good at presentations. So that one, I see sort of a mixed bag there. You really need to have some way to make it objective. So that's why the soft skills are something that are more of a performance management discussion as far as getting people the right training they need, but not necessarily something that's useful when it comes to capacity versus demand. Okay. Now, to use the skills, you have to keep in mind the way that the skills would be typically used in an organization is you want to do reporting on it. So how much of a type of skill do I have in the organization? How much type of skill do I need in the organization? Those are all reports and measures. What's my ratio of DBAs versus project managers? What's my ratio of people who have, energy industry experience versus medical equipment? So those are all reports and measures to kind of slice and dice to see what the makeup is of your organization. And of course, staffing. So the skills are useful for staffing to understand what kind of skills you have and what kind of skills you need. So that factors into the capacity versus demand. And then from a talent management perspective, of course, understanding the roadmaps of people having to get additional training or to learn new skills to be able to meet your demands that are coming in. Now, the key metrics that I find useful for many organizations is, and all of these are demand versus capacity in some way. So demand versus capacity for billable resources. Just in general, how many deliverable hours do I need to have available in the organization to meet the demand of the type of work that I'm going to be delivering. And that could be in hours or in headcount type thing. So I'm selling so much work that it's the equivalent of 7 headcount. I only have 5 on staff. So either those 5 are going to work really long hours, or I have to go higher and anticipate the growth in that area. And then, of course, the next level down from that is what job category are people. So how many PMs do I have? How many architects do I have? How many QA people do I have? And how many are being requested based on the type of work that I'm selling? You also want to factor in not only from a forecast of the pipeline of, hey, here's what's coming, do I have enough people to deliver it? Will that drive how I schedule what the work's going to be doing? But also in the backlog, once you close deals, you have to deliver on them. And so knowing the makeup of that sale by type of resource gives you the ability to line up with, well, I'm short on PMs. Is there someone who has done PM in the past? You do skill database lookups, and now you start finding resources. So demand versus capacity is more of a leading metric to say, just based on regular tagging, this is what you have, but do you have some additional resources available to fulfill that? Okay. And finally, a revenue target versus capacity. So this is a slightly different thing. So it's demand versus capacity is sort of normal operational view. Here's what I have, here's what I need. Here's what I have, here's what I need. The revenue target versus capacity is a slight twist on the demand. That's more of a budgeting type thing. It's more of a health of the organization type thing. It's here's what I expect to hit as far as numbers this year, and here's what I could potentially hit based on what I have today. So it's not necessarily driven by the sales pipeline. It's not driven by what's been sold. That's sales and business operations. In here, you're actually just trying to say, do I have enough to get this done? Okay. Do I have enough resources? Do I have enough hours? Do I have my target set correctly for me to even be able to achieve the target that I've set for myself? Okay. So for all of these reports, what you need to consider is hours that equate to things like headcount or full-time equivalent. That's what FTE means, full-time equivalent. And then a money factor for the revenue piece of it. So factoring in things like target bill rates and what the sold rate is, those are all values that you should be able to get out of like a PSA tool, because numbers abound in a PSA tool, and it's really a matter of connecting those numbers together to get the metrics and the reports that you want. So here are the dependencies that I've found that are necessary to be able to meet those metrics, to be able to do your capacity versus demand measures. And I'm very graphical, so I always think in terms of graphs and comparing things side by side. So to be able to report on capacity, and remember capacity is what you have, and that would point to as a leading indicator to things that you may end up having to plan for staffing. So to get hours-based reports out of any type of tool like a PSA tool, you will have to have what is the definition of a working week or a working day, so that you understand what, when somebody is full-time, what does that mean? How many hours does that mean for that resource to even be available? And resources can be available in varying degrees. Some people are full-time, some people are 3 days a week, some people work a 45-hour week, and that's their work schedule. It all depends on your business. You also have to have a target so that you can understand what it means for them to be full-time billable, full-time equivalent billable. So when you hire a resource, every working hour and every hour that they're sitting at their desk or on the road does not mean that that hour is billable. There's lots of methods out there, and as far as productivity and stuff out there regarding what does it mean to be billable and what does it mean to be productive in a working day. So these targets, this target utilization, tend to be driven by. So when I work with somebody and I'm reporting to work in an 8-hour day, how many of those hours can I realistically be expected to be billable? Or sort of push the edge, I should be billable, I should strive to achieve that. So things like 75%, 80%, 60%, whatever's equivalent for your organization is the target that you would have to establish. You also have to establish job categories and teams so that you have a way to group resources. So this is where it kind of goes to the tagging of people by skills or tagging people by job categories or both to be able to understand how many are, you are a DBA, so you show up in the DBA pile. Okay. And the skill categories, same type of thing. From a money perspective, when you're dealing with capacity, you do need to define a target bill rate. And that's pretty much it, in my view. The target bill rate, it could be by type of resource, it could be by level of resource or seniority of resource, but regardless, you have to define a target bill rate to multiply by all those hours values that are in the list above. Now the same kind of look at the demand, when you're doing hours-based demand, you really need to plug into how are you scheduling the resources, how are you planning out the hours that are coming in. That tends to be driven by your resource scheduling methodology. The planning of hours, and then being able to understand what kind of hours are they, what kind of person is needed for that. So this can be a job category or a placeholder or generic name that says, I need a DBA, I need an Oracle DBA to be able to do this work. And then also this key skill set. So I need a DBA, and then an Oracle DBA would be a version of that would say, here's the skill that I need. I need an Oracle DBA. I need a senior Oracle DBA. And then from a money perspective, the money here is a little different because demand is based on how you do your revenue forecasting, your money forecasting. So at a basic level, from a bottom-up calculation, if you plan out the hours that you're expecting to sell or that you have in backlog, there's a rate associated with that. So you multiply that together, and that becomes the money base of your demand, the value of an engagement. But there's a slight variation also that some companies will do, which they'll say, hey, it's $1 million deal, we're going to deliver it over the next year, so they just spread that $1 million over the whole year so that you have some kind of money value to compare to, in general, do I have enough people to even reach $1 million over a year? So that's a very simplistic method. It doesn't rely so much on hours, but it really does drive more high-level revenue target type alignment. And of course, demand is very connected into your forecasting methodology. So as you put it all together, you start establishing the methods for how are you doing your planning, your resource, your forecasting to drive that demand in order for you to even define your capacity versus demand metrics. By setting up a skill database, you can break that job category of resources down a level so that you can identify key skills that you need to focus on for hiring or retraining in the organization for talent management. And you need to put a review in place to make sure that as people are categorized and as you set targets, that those targets are kept accurate, your target bill rates are kept accurate, that skills and categories are accurate for people in order for the equivalent capacity values to be accurate for use. And then you measure the demand based on what you're seeing come in, like in the examples I have on the screen here, versus what you have. And in this example, I have plenty of QA people, but I'm running out of consultants. So can the QA people fill the gap for the consultants and for the DBAs?